Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Friedhoff. This is going to be the beginning of chapter 15. Now, in the last couple chapters, we've been really focusing on DNA and specifically how DNA kind of codes for our characteristics, and that being the central dogma, going from DNA to RNA to a protein. Now, that importance, the central dogma of all of our biology, that's that genetic information going from DNA to a protein, that really determines our physical features. And it's because of these proteins that we've been talking about that's where we get our physical features. Now we're going to really transition to a different topic. Biotechnology incorporates a lot of the DNA that we've just talked about, but we're going to kind of shift gears away from biotechnology and now really focus on evolution. Evolution really does incorporate a lot of DNA, and we're going to start talking about DNA in the first couple sections, but it is a really different part of biology. Now, we've talked about DNA, or we've talked about evolution a little bit in the beginning of the year and how, evolution really ties in a lot of different aspects of biology. But this is where we're really going to start to see where evolution and how evolution takes place. So with that being said, we're going to start into section 1 here in a second, but this is a pretty big chapter just because of how important it is just in general. Now, at the beginning of this section, section 15.1, I like to show a video. I'm not going to be able to show it here because I don't want my PowerPoint or my lecture video to be copyrighted. But basically, it's just like a introduction of evolution. It's like, where do we get this information from? How do we conduct science? And Bill Nye actually narrates it. It's a really good video. But basically, it just kind of sets up of where do we come from? Like that's the answer we're trying to, or that's the question we're trying to get to is where do we all come from? Where did all these species come from? Where did all this evolution come from? And I like to start out here with time. There have been massive amounts of time that occurred since the beginning of our universe till now, and this is something that we have to wrap our head around first before we can really get into evolution. And we're going to be talking about and doing some activities in class that show us just how many millions to billions of years have elapsed since that beginning of time till now. Couple different figures I like the students to know is that the universe has been around since about 13.8 billion years ago. Our Earth has been around since about 4.5 billion years ago. Life has been around for about 3.8 billion years, and the first life was prokaryotic, which means it was single-celled, wasn't very complex, for nearly 2 billion years. So all these dates I like to kind of go over with my students before we get into what evolution is, because this kind of gives us the framework and kind of sets us up to understand how evolution could have occurred for that long. So on a clock, if you look here, most of time, most of our just existence on Earth has been very simple, very, single celled. It wasn't until if we look at it like, midnight being, the beginning of the universe till now, it wasn't until about 10.8 or 10 o'clock where we start seeing the first life being multicellular and complex. And really, humans have only been on Earth for just a couple of seconds because of, just the overwhelming time that has occurred since the beginning of the universe till now. So really the focus of this section is just to set up the idea that the Earth is very old. It's billions of years old, and same with life. It's billions of years old. A couple other things to go over in this section. Life or evolution doesn't describe how life began. Evolution just describes how life has changed since then. So don't think that evolution specifically, talks about the beginnings of life. It more looks at how life has changed since that point. All right, 15.2 is going to look at the gentleman who discovered the theory of natural selection, or really came to understand evolution, which his name is Charles Darwin. There's going to be a lot of just stuff or material that we go over in this section that you don't have to write down. I only think there's actually a couple slides here. I like to talk about the history of Darwin, just because obviously he was a very influential scientist, and a lot of his background just interesting, and you don't really need to memorize. So before Darwin, this is the pre-1800s. Species, or people don't think that species change or go exist. They thought that no new species could be created, and they thought that the Earth was only a couple thousand years old. So there was a lot of ideas in this time period that were just incorrect. They didn't think that new species could be created, or that new species could evolve, or just that species that were here, they thought that species that were here today have always been here, and that no species could actually go extinct. That's obviously wrong. And they also thought the Earth was a couple thousand years old. They just didn't have the science, they didn't have the data, they didn't have the understanding of deep time. And wasn't until about the 1800s that there were scientists that went against that notion and said, "Hey, these things aren't right. We're getting evidence, and we're learning about the Earth, and just learning that the Earth is very old, and that species change, and that species can go extinct, and new species can arise." There were a couple of geologists, names were Charles Lyell and James Hutton, that discovered this, the concept of deep time, and that basically that the Earth is just billions of years old and not a couple thousand years old. And this is where, again, our understanding of geology really starts to take off. Now, another scientist that we should know about, his name is Lamarck. He came around and proposed that species could change. So he's like, yeah, hey, I think species can change, but he wasn't right in the ways that they could change. He proposed that organisms could pass on acquired characteristics. These are characteristics that you acquire over a lifetime. So, like, let's say, I get a scar on my face, or I lose like a limb, or I, work out a lot and get really strong. He thought that you could pass those traits on to your offspring. And obviously, that's not true because those things just don't happen. So he was right in the fact that species could change, but he just didn't understand how species could pass on those changes. He also proposed that organisms could produce a new trait based on a need. So, like, let's say a species need to get faster, so the organism could just will into existence really a new trait. And obviously, again, that's not true because you can't change your phenotypes just based on the needs of the environment. So the reason why we're talking about Lamarck is he proposed the first testable explanation, but he got it wrong. Lamarck did say that species could change, and like you can see here, these are Lamarck's giraffes. He thought that the giraffe's neck could elongate because they would be used more, and then they would pass that trait down to their offspring. Now, again, obviously, this is not correct. This is not how species change, but this at least gives us like a starting point for where evolution could take place. All right, the next part of chapter 15.2 is going to be on Charles Darwin. And again, we're going to start back in his earlier days, basically just to show how he came to the understanding of the theory of natural selection. So, Darwin was born in 1809. He was born in England and was born to a wealthy family. They kind of were a little bit noble, if you could say, at that time. His father was a physician or like a doctor, but his mother died at a very young age. And the reason why I put that in there is this shows that Darwin had to really cope with death at a very young age. And we're going to talk about what that may have, or how that may have influenced his understanding of just the natural world later on in life. Darwin also showed an early interest in like history or natural history. He was a collector of plants, insect shells. He liked to be outside. He liked to go on nature walks. He just loved everything outside. So he was a very inquisitive young man. But his father sent him to medical school, and he absolutely hated it. His father said, "Hey, you have to do something with your life." So again, he sent him to a college, and he dropped out. So I always like to point out that even if you drop out of somewhere, you don't make it the first time, you don't succeed in the first try. Everyone in biology knows Charles Darwin, so to kind of look up to him with if you ever fail at something, you can always still make it in life. His father then sent him to ministry school afterwards. He said, "Hey, you have to do something. Let's try out another school." Again, he really liked his science classes, but he did finish out, but didn't obviously become a minister. Years later, let me see here. Years later, he went to he went on a voyage called the Voyage of the HMS Beagle, and basically they were mapping out the coastline of South America. Now, a lot of people think that he went. This is Darwin. Went as a naturalist on the ship, like he went to experiment and go, see nature and take observations. But he was actually just a companion to the captain, just because of the time period. They didn't allow like the captains to socialize with the crewmen. So these captains would just bring along friends to these voyages. And Darwin was that friend to Captain Fitzroy. So he basically just was like a friend to the captain on this voyage. Now, along the way here, you can see this is the path that he took. They mapped out the South American coastline. He stopped at a location called the Galapagos Islands. These Galapagos Islands are volcanic islands on the western side of South America, close to Ecuador. And they are some pretty interesting islands. And basically, what we see on these islands is that these islands are very different from each other because they were exposed to the just the occurrence at different time periods. So what Darwin saw on these islands were different species. And these species showed that each island was kind of specific with which organisms, evolved there. And these were almost like a perfect experiment for evolution to take place because each island is so different. I always like to add into this section some pictures from my trip to the Galapagos. So I went with some students a couple years ago on a school-funded field trip, and so we got to see a lot of the same things that Darwin saw on the islands. And one of the species that Darwin saw were these Galapagos tortoises. These are absolutely massive creatures. And the really cool thing about these tortoises is they are a little bit different on each island. You can see here, each island has a species on it that just appears a little bit different, whether it's their shell size, whether it's their necks, whether it's their size in general. Each species or each island's organisms are a little bit different, and it's because those islands, well, I don't want to give it away, but basically the species or the populations on those islands evolved differently than species found on different islands because their environments were a little bit different. We see that the birds there, the finches, also underwent this evolution. You can see different types of these bird species and where they're found, or how they interact with the environment, whether they eat things like insects or seeds or cactus. But basically, these birds also evolved a little bit differently on each island. So, in our next section, 15.3, we're going to talk about what Darwin actually saw. And what Darwin saw was a competition for resources. Obviously, on these islands, you're going to see a fierce competition for a small amount of resources. That's because, again, islands, in this case, don't have a lot of those resources just because they're very far away from the mainland, and if you leave the islands, you're just going to find more water. So the competition we see on these islands was almost like a perfect experiment for us to witness evolution. So again, there's competition between organisms for small amounts of resources on those islands. In certain cases, certain organisms are going to be able to survive and reproduce more because they have adaptations that allow them to get more of these resources. And when we talk about these adaptations, they're because of something called genetic variation. Now, we've talked a little bit about genetic variation before, but basically we get two different places where we see genetic variation. First, mutations. Sometimes mutations give us beneficial adaptations or beneficial phenotypes. This is because there's some change in the genetic code that allows our cells or our proteins to give us an advantage. We also see this through like meiosis and sexual reproduction because again, no matter how many times two organisms have kids, those kids are going to have different genes, and unless they're twins, so that gives us another place of genetic variation. But these adaptations are just inherited characteristics. They're going to improve an organism's ability to survive and reproduce in a particular environment. So certain organisms are going to survive better. So like these large ground finches can eat the seeds better than like finches with smaller beaks. However, these smaller beaks are better for insects because again, they can get their beaks into like little crevices better than the large beak. So just because one organism has an adaptation doesn't mean it's always going to be the best adaptation for a particular environment. Each island would select for a particular species or particular adaptations based on that island's resources. So again, these adaptations are going and how they are successful are going to be based on the island they're going to be found on. The ability of an organism to both survive and reproduce is called fitness. Fitness in our terms usually means like how strong you are. In evolutionary terms, it means more of the sense of how well do you survive and how well do you pass on your genes? How well do you reproduce? You can see here we have a lower fitness organism that doesn't produce a lot of offspring, or a higher fitness organism that does produce a lot of offspring. And lastly, we're going to talk about something called natural selection. This is what Darwin witnessed on the islands. This is a process by which individuals with more beneficial traits are going to survive and reproduce more than others. So in this case, you can see, again, here's our population of beetles with variation. Some beetles are tan, some beetles are green. Because the bird doesn't want to expel a lot of energy, it's going to eat the green ones more often. That means they're going to be selected out of the population. They're going to be killed and eaten. In this case, then the next generation is going to be more tan than green. This is evolution, where natural processes are going to select for certain organisms that have certain adaptations to survive and reproduce more. All right, now we're going to the fourth section of chapter 15. This is going to be on the origin of species. So basically, this is where we're going to see how Darwin came to his understanding of evolution. So remember, Darwin was on the Galapagos Islands, and he didn't just automatically understand evolution. It's not like he saw the islands, he saw the different species, he saw how the environments, shaped or caused the different organisms, the different populations to evolve. It wasn't like he had a eureka moment. He started to think about these things on the islands, and they started to materialize through 20 more years of evidence gathering, thinking, corresponding with scientists. So he was thinking about evolution. He was trying to develop his theory over many years. It wasn't like, again, he instantly understood evolution. So that's one big misconception people have. People think that he got to the Galapagos and was like, oh, I understand evolution. Now let me write about it. He saw what he saw on the Galapagos, and he took from there some information, but he took years to come to his conclusion about natural selection. Now, he did witness something called artificial selection. This is how humans can change populations. This is just the deliberate selection of reproduction of organisms by humans for desired traits. So if you look here, we have our original population. If these two parents or these two plants get picked for the next generation, you can see that next generation is a lot taller because these plants have tall genes. Now, not every single one of them is going to be tall, but there's going to be a larger percent that are tall. And we see a lot of different organisms that have been artificially selected for. For example, like dogs coming from ancient wolves, cats coming from ancient feline species, domesticated cows, chickens have evolved to be bigger and bigger. Domesticated pigs have been obviously made to be a lot more meatier. Corn, different types of vegetables, fruits have been really selected for. You can see again what watermelon looks like now versus even just a couple hundred years ago. Bananas. But all of these things led Darwin to understand evolution a little bit better. Now, he also corresponded with a scientist named Alfred Russel Wallace. Alfred Russel Wallace was on his own journey years after Darwin on his journey, but basically he was looking at the same kind of things. How do species change based on their environment? And he wrote a 20-page manuscript kind of just outlining his understanding of evolution. And what he did was he sent it to Darwin and said, hey, can you critique this? And when Darwin saw this, he was like, oh my gosh, this is exactly what I'm thinking. And Darwin really wanted to publish his work before, Alfred Russel Wallace did. And you would think this would create kind of like a controversy, but Darwin and Wallace actually became really good friends. They became lifelong friends. And Wallace gave credit to Darwin for coming to the theory of natural selection before he did. He actually wrote his book and he named it Darwinism just because of how profound and how much evidence Darwin had presented with his theory of natural selection. So, just the last kind of note here, Darwin did publish his work before Wallace did. He had, again, years and years of evidence and years of writing about this, and he published it in 1859, and it was widely accepted throughout the scientific community. But it's called On the Origin of Species. And this is, again, one of the most profound scientific journals or entries or just research that is done on biology and really revolutionized biology and gave us a central theme of how all of biology works. Couple different concepts I want to go over here in the next section, 15.5, relate to biology, and they're going to be about just how species change. Now, something we look at when we look at evolution is something called biogeography, and obviously this has to do with where organisms are placed. You can see here these organisms look very similar because again they evolved from a recent common ancestor. This is called biogeography, just the distribution of how species and plants, or more, I'm sorry, plants and animals more specifically, are located on the Earth. So what we see is the more closely related to organisms appear, the more closely they tend to be geographically. So you can see these organisms are very close to each other. They look very similar to each other because they evolved from a recent common ancestor. That's because, again, common ancestry is where two organisms are going to have like a relation or a last common ancestor they are related to. We have this with our, human ancestry. If you look here, like you and your siblings, your common ancestor is your parents. You and your cousins share a common ancestor of your great grandparents, or sorry, your grandparents. Your second cousins have a common ancestor with you with your great grandparents. So the further you go back in time, the 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 more organisms or more like are people you're related to. Same thing with like how humans are related to all mammals. We have a common ancestor with all mammals, but it lived millions of years ago. We have a common ancestor with all amphibians that lived even further back. We have a common ancestor with all fish that lived even further back. These are millions and millions of years. So this common ancestry or common ancestor vocab term is just saying, hey, what organism do all of these organisms relate to? How far back do we have to go? And this kind of brings us to our tree of life. This is just basically looking at how all life on Earth is related. And if you look, this is what Darwin actually wrote in his journal. He wrote that he said, I think, and he showed this tree of life. He showed that every organism is related to each other. You just have to go back far enough based on how closely those organisms are related. So again, we are very closely related to like other primates and mammals, but we are still related to like trees. We just have to go back far enough on this tree of life. Hello, everyone. This is going to be our last section on chapter 15, where we look at the evidence of evolution. I like to have the students remember the word FAME to remember the evidence of evolution. This is a fossil, anatomical, molecular, and embryological. So we're going to go over one slide per set of evidence, and I know it's going to be a lot of information, but again, this is only just one slide. You see, fossils are remains of once living organisms, and they basically show us how life on Earth has evolved through just their fossil record. We have something called the law of superposition that states that Earth that is lower in the geological timeline, you can see here the deeper we go, is older compared to with the layers on top, which are younger. And what we see is the complexity of fossils increasing as we get close to the top. This is, again, just because complexity of life has increased over time. So this fossil record is very extensive. Even though we might not have every organism and every species and how it's changed, we see an extensive fossil record in our geological timeline. Now, we also have something called anatomical structures. These are structures that show us how things have evolved throughout time. So we have something called homologous structures. These are structures that are similar because they are inherited from a common ancestor. You can see here, this one bone, two bone, many bone feature is seen in all tetrapods, but how that tetrapod arm has evolved is different because like whales evolved differently than humans, lizards evolved differently than birds. Their needs were a little bit different, so these appendages evolved a little bit differently. Analogous structures. These are body parts that have similar structures, but they evolved separately. So all three of these organisms have the ability to fly. However, they evolved the wing a little bit differently. You can see like the really long fingers in bats, the really long arm in birds, and then this different really appendage. It's almost like a flap for the butterflies and insects. So each of these organisms evolved a similar appendage. However, they all did this differently. And last, we have vestigial organs. These are body parts that have lost their original function over time, but they still kind of have them there. So whales used to walk on land, or ancient whales, before the whales moved back into the oceans. So they have this pelvis bone or pelvic bone that helps them or would help them on land, but they still have it and they don't need it, but it's still a part of their body. It's called a vestigial organ. Our last section or last part of this section is going to be about the DNA that supports the evidence of evolution. And what we see is the more similar two organisms are, the more closely their DNA is going to be. And this is just because they share a more recent common ancestor. So what we can see is we can see that DNA sequences, again, show us that these organisms are very close to each other since their amino acid sequence, their proteins, their DNA are very similar to each other. I like to show this image here where we look at the amount of DNA that each organism shares. So obviously we share a lot with like chimpanzees and gorillas because we share a very recent common ancestor with them. And the further we go down this list, the less we have in common percent-wise of DNA. However, it's still a lot or very similar. So like us and dogs, us and cats, us and mice share a very recent common ancestor, meaning millions of years old. So we share a lot of DNA together. But like us and a banana, we only share about 50% of the DNA. But again, that's because we don't have a very recent common ancestor. That common ancestor is millions and millions of years old. Lastly, we also have something called embryological evidence. This is just looking at how our embryos develop very recently or very commonly to each other. You can see like us and different organisms like chicken, tortoises, salamanders, fish. We all share very similar pathways through embryological development, but we have a lot of differences as well.